In the lush mountains of Antioquia, Julian Ramirez, a humble and hard-working farmer, lived a peaceful life growing coffee and raising chickens alongside his wife and 2 children. One day on his way back from the market, he came across a man gravely wounded on the side of the trail. Without a second thought, he carried him to his farm to give him aid, unaware that the stranger was none other than Pablo Escobar, the most wanted drug lord in the country. Grateful for the help he had received, Escobar swore he would never forget such an act of kindness. Weeks later, a strange gift arrived at the farm, changing Julian's life forever. As Julian struggled to understand what was happening, he found himself trapped in a web of favors, silence, and commitments that would put at risk his conscience, the well-being of his family, and even his very survival. The sun burned fiercely over the mountains surrounding San Carlos, a small village hidden among dirt paths and dense coffee plantations. Julian Ramirez, 42 years old, moved slowly as he pushed his old mule, loaded with sacks of rice and corn. He had already been walking for 3 hours from the neighboring town's market. He wore his usual straw hat, a patched-up shirt and mud-stained boots. The song of birds and the crunch of dry leaves beneath his feet kept him company. Halfway along the route, near the old wooden bridge crossing the El Salado River, something broke the routine. A faint groan, almost a whisper, came from the vegetation at the side of the path. "Who's there?" asked Julian, stopping in his tracks. He cautiously moved closer, pushing aside the bushes with his machete. Then he saw him, a man covered in blood, his shirt torn, face swollen, and a deep wound on his leg. He was very pale but still conscious. "Help me, please," the man murmured in a weak voice. Julian didn't ask any questions. He didn't recognize him. He only saw someone in need and chose to act. He cut a thick branch, improvised a stretcher, and placed the man on his mule. Hours later, back at home, his wife Rosa watched him anxiously. "What if he's a criminal, Julian? What if this brings us trouble?" "I don't know, Rosa. All I know is that he needed help. God put us in this world to do good," he replied as he cleaned the wound with boiled water and mallow leaves. The man spoke little, barely ate, and slept for hours. When awake, he observed everything with a disturbing calm. For several days, Julian cared for him as if he were family, expecting nothing in return. On the 6th day, the stranger managed to stand. Though still limping, he had regained some strength. "Thank you, Don Julian. You have no idea what you've done for me. One day you'll understand." The man scribbled something on a piece of paper, handed it to him, and disappeared down the same path he had come. Julian looked at the paper. No address, only a name, Simón Bolívar. What Julian didn't know was that this was one of the pseudonyms Pablo Escobar used to move around undetected. 2 weeks passed since the wounded man's departure. Julian returned to his daily routine, tending the crops, feeding the animals, praying before bed. Though the memory of the stranger lingered, he chose not to mention anything to the neighbors. In the countryside, silence was sometimes worth more than the truth. One morning, while picking oranges in the orchard, he saw a black truck approaching on the dusty road. Vehicles that luxurious were rare in the area. The engine stopped in front of his house. 2 well-dressed men got out. One wore dark sunglasses, the other carried a carved wooden box. "Are you Julian Ramirez?" asked the man in sunglasses. "Yes, sir," Julian answered cautiously. "This is for you. A gift from a friend." He said you'd know why. Before Julian could say a word, the men got back in the truck and disappeared among the trees. Julian looked at the box. It was heavy. He carried it to the kitchen, where Rosa and the children stared wide-eyed. "What is it, Julian?" "I don't know. Something left by that man, the one who was wounded." He carefully opened the box. Inside was an envelope with his name handwritten on it, and beneath it, a large sum of money in bills, held together with a leather strap. It was more than he had ever seen in his life. With trembling hands he opened the envelope. Inside was only a short message: "Thank you for not asking. Take care of your own." Silence filled the kitchen. Rosa collapsed onto a chair, pale. Julian slowly stood, walked to the door, and gazed at the horizon. Something had changed and there was no turning back. "What are we going to do with this?" Rosa whispered. Julian took a deep breath. He remained silent for a few seconds, though deep down he already knew. That act of generosity had pulled him into a situation far more complex than he could grasp. The following days were filled with tension. He hid the box of money beneath a loose floorboard in the pantry, and only Rosa knew of its existence. Though they hadn't spent a single bill, its mere presence weighed on them like a constant burden. In the village, rumors began to spread. Some claimed to have seen a wounded man in the mountains. Others talked about a fancy truck passing along trails where no vehicle usually went. Julian listened without a word, sipping his coffee at the store, trying hard to appear indifferent. One afternoon, while fixing a fence, his neighbor Don Efren approached. "They say strange things have been happening around here," he remarked with a probing tone. "Have you noticed anything?" "Nothing strange, compadre. Just coffee fields and rainstorms," Julian replied without lifting his eyes from the wire. Efren studied him for a moment, then walked away in silence. Julian realized then that suspicion was starting to grow. That night, as they ate in silence, Rosa broke the tension. "We can't keep living like this, Julian. Each day it feels more unsettling. That money isn't ours." "We didn't harm anyone, Rosa. We just helped a man," he answered firmly, though inside he felt the same fear. As the weeks passed, Julian used a small portion of the money. He bought some tools, repaired the roof, and paid debts with the cooperative. He acted with caution, but in a small village, changes never go unnoticed. One dawn he found a sheet of paper slipped under the door. No sender, just one phrase written in a firm hand. "Don't forget who lent you a hand. Sometimes help comes with a price." Julian read the message several times, then looked at Rosa sleeping and stepped out into the yard. The cold wind came down from the mountain. In that moment he realized he was no longer the sole master of his own fate. The silence he had chosen to keep had chained him to something far deeper and darker. The next morning an eerie stillness lingered. Not even the roosters crowed. Julian woke before dawn. Ever since reading that note, sleep had abandoned him. Something told him peace was over. By mid-morning, while picking coffee beans on the hillside, he heard the sound of a motorcycle engine approaching. Looking down, he saw a man stopping in front of his house. He wasn't from the area. He wore a leather jacket, black boots, and carried a stern expression. Julian descended immediately. By the time he arrived, the stranger was already speaking with Rosa on the porch. She stood with her arms crossed, visibly nervous. "Are you Julian Ramirez?" the man asked bluntly. "Yes." "And who are you?" "Simone Bolivar sent me to tell you that for now everything is in order, but don't forget what was given to you." "And what do they expect from me?" "For now, nothing. Just keep doing what you've been doing, working, keeping quiet, and being available if necessary." He didn't wait for a reply. He mounted the motorcycle and rode away, leaving behind a cloud of dust, and a threat hanging in the air. That night, Julian didn't eat. He sat on the doorstep of the house, staring into the darkness. "We've gotten ourselves into something we don't understand," he whispered. Rosa joined him in silence. No words were needed. They both knew they were no longer just farmers. They had crossed an invisible, dangerous line. And whether they wanted it or not, they now belonged to a hidden world. As the days went by, Julian began to notice a subtle but undeniable shift in the village's atmosphere. People no longer greeted him with the same warmth. At the store, conversations would stop the moment he walked in. At church, some eyed him with suspicion. Even Don Efren, his lifelong neighbor, had begun to avoid him. "People are talking," Rosa said one afternoon as they peeled cassava in the kitchen. "And you've been shutting down as if you had something to hide." "It's not guilt, it's fear," Julian replied. "This isn't just between us and that man anymore." Even their children began to notice the change. Camilo, the eldest, only 12, asked one day, "Dad, why don't we go to the village anymore?" "Because we have more work here now. And that's all." That's all. But it wasn't all. Julian felt trapped. The money remained hidden. He didn't dare spend it, nor could he get rid of it. It was like a constant reminder that his life was no longer entirely his own. One afternoon, while gathering firewood in the woods, he came across something unexpected. Hanging from the branch of a tree was a new message: "We are watching you." It was then he understood he was being surveilled, that no matter how hard he tried to act normal, he was already part of an invisible web. His mistake hadn't been helping, but keeping quiet when he discovered who the wounded man truly was. And now his silence weighed heavier than any sin. That night, after reading the new note, Julian couldn't sleep. He wandered the farm in the darkness, shotgun slung over his shoulder, more from fear than protection. He felt something was closing in, something unseen but tightening around him with each passing moment. At dawn, Rosa was waiting for him with coffee ready and a resolute look in her eyes. "We can't go on like this, Julian. This silence is eating us alive." "And what do you suggest? That we leave? Sell the farm or just abandon it? Let's go far away, somewhere no one knows anything about us." Julian lowered his head. Just the thought of leaving the land he had inherited from his grandfather, the coffee trees he had planted with his own hands, hurt more than any threat. But when he looked at Rosa and the children, he understood that staying could be even worse. That very day he went to the village. He only wanted to speak to a trusted lawyer, to know if he could sell without drawing attention. But before he could, a woman from the neighborhood stopped him on the street. "Don Julian, be careful. People say you're involved with dangerous men. They're watching you." He didn't answer. He walked back home slowly as if the road grew longer with each step. When he arrived, he found another note, this time nailed to the door. "Your family is safe as long as you stay where you are." That's when he realized he was no longer free, that his choices no longer mattered, and that trying to escape would be seen as betrayal. That night, by the fire, he held Rosa in silence. She understood just from his eyes. They would not leave, not by choice, not while they remained useful to someone who never appeared but was always present. The message was clear, they were not going anywhere. So Julian returned to his routine as if nothing had changed. He tended the coffee, fed the animals, greeted the neighbors, but deep down he knew someone was watching from the shadows. One afternoon, as he returned from the river with a bundle of firewood, a white truck pulled up in front of his house. This time there were two new faces, one thin with sharp features, the other younger with a strong Paisa accent. "Good afternoon, Don Julian," greeted the older one as he stepped out of the vehicle. "We're here from the office, you know who we're talking about." Julian nodded silently. "We need you to do us a small favor. Just lend us your farm for one night, nothing more." "What are you going to do?" "That's none of your business. Just make sure no one's around and by morning, nothing will have happened." Rosa came out to the doorway worried. Julian motioned for her to go back inside. "And if I refuse?" he asked quietly. "You won't refuse," replied the younger man with a joyless smile. "Because you know favors must be repaid." That night, Julian didn't close his eyes. He spent the hours on the porch watching. First 2 motorcycles arrived, then a van. There were no words, no violence, only quick, silent movements. By dawn, everything was gone as if it had never happened, but something had changed. Julian was no longer just the man who once helped a stranger. Now he was part of something, not by choice but because he had kept silent from the very beginning. In the morning when he walked into the kitchen he found another box on the table, smaller, more discreet, containing more money and a note. "Thank you for your trust. We'll be in touch again." Julian closed the box without a word. He knew that another call would come, and with each one, it would become harder to look at his wife and children without feeling he was leading them toward a bottomless abyss. The following days passed in silence. He worked as always, but his gaze betrayed the constant burden, like carrying an invisible debt that only grew heavier. Rosa noticed immediately. "What did they do that night on our farm, Julian?" "I don't know, and I'd rather not know." "That's not an answer," she said firmly. "We have children, a life, and now we live in fear, with locked doors and hidden envelopes." Julian didn't respond. Deep down he knew she was right, but he also knew that speaking out meant putting everything at risk. It was no longer just his life, it was all of theirs. Even Camillo, his eldest son, had become more withdrawn. He watched his father in silence, imitated his gestures, followed him through the fields. One afternoon he caught him rummaging in the pantry. "What are you looking for, Camillo?" "Nothing. I just wanted to see if what they say is true, that you keep money hidden." "You've been found out." Julian froze, took a deep breath, crouched down to his son's level and replied. "Son, there are things you will understand one day, but for now, trust me." Camillo stared at him, saying nothing, but Julian felt that something between them had broken. Something that once bound them together and was now replaced by uncertainty. That night Rosa was direct. "This is pulling us apart," she said firmly. "You're not the same anymore and neither is Camillo. If we go on like this, one day someone will knock on that door and there will be no turning back." Julian remained seated in the dim light, his head in his hands. The money was still hidden, the bills kept coming, but it was no longer just about resisting outside pressure. It was about not losing himself in the process. The sky dawned overcast, with a heaviness in the air that pressed against the body. Julian rose before the first ray of sunlight with a premonition he couldn't explain. He sensed it in the strange silence of the countryside, in the way the dogs stood still. A dark green truck pulled up in front of the farm. It was no surprise. Julian already recognized the sound of those engines. 2 men got out, one of them the young man who had brought the first crate weeks earlier. "Don Julian," he said bluntly, "today we need a more direct favor. You just have to deliver something. Nothing complicated." Julian didn't respond. The young man pulled out a package covered with a black tarp and placed it on a sack. "Take it to the tire shop in town. Say it comes from the sower." Leave it in the back storeroom. Don't talk to anyone. Don't look at anyone. And what am I carrying? Asked Julian, though deep down he already suspected. That's none of your concern, said the other with a smile devoid of warmth. But if you do it right, there will be more tasks, more rewards, and fewer problems for your family. Julian lowered his gaze. Camillo's face flashed in his mind like a silent warning. He said no more. He loaded the burden onto the mule and set off toward the town. With every step he felt the weight of the irreversible. Every curve in the path reminded him there was no going back. Upon reaching the shop, he followed the instructions without deviation. No one spoke to him. He spoke to no one. A man came out of the storeroom, took the package, and handed him a sealed envelope. Back at the farm, Julian opened the envelope in private. Inside was money, far more than he would earn in several months of work. There was also a handwritten note. Good job. People like you inspire trust. He hid the money in its usual place and sat beneath the eaves of the house. The breeze slowly stirred the coffee leaves. He felt no pride, no relief, only an emptiness expanding inside him, as if part of him had been left behind in that shop, buried in silence. 3 days passed since that delivery. Julian tried to return to his routine, but he was no longer the same. He walked more cautiously, senses alert, aware that he had crossed a definitive line. On a cloudy afternoon, while gathering firewood near the stream, the green truck appeared once again. This time only one man got out, different from the others, middle-aged, well-dressed, with polite manners but heavy with intent. Don Julian, he greeted calmly, I'm glad to see you. We've been keeping an eye on you and we value your discretion. Julian dropped the firewood to the ground and said nothing. We want to offer you something more stable, nothing risky, just helping with deliveries in this area. You know the roads, and here knowing how to keep quiet is worth a lot. And if I decide not to? He asked. For now, nothing happens, the man replied kindly. No one forces anyone here, but we all expect loyalty. She did not answer immediately, only watched him with a restrained pain that hurt more than any reproach. At 3 a.m. the phone rang. Julian picked it up with trembling hands and answered. Don Julian, it's something small. Tomorrow at 8 o'clock your son Camillo must take a bag to the village. Tonight we'll leave it for you. No one suspects a child. You understand, right? The call was cut before he could reply. Julian stood motionless, the phone still in his hand, in the dark. For the first time, it was not him who had to obey but his son. And at that moment he understood. It was no longer about following orders, but about protecting what little remained untouched in his life. Dawn came with a heavy fog. Julian had spent the entire night awake, sitting near the door. The phone, now unplugged, lay on the table. At 5 o'clock he heard a faint knock at the back of the house. He slipped out silently. There, tied tightly with a double knot, hung a school backpack on one of the fence posts. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside. He went back inside with the backpack in hand. Rosa watched him from the kitchen, saying nothing, though her eyes spoke volumes. Camillo, still in pajamas, came out of the room rubbing his eyes. Today we're going to the village, Dad. Julian took a deep breath. No, son, not today. And this backpack isn't yours. The boy frowned, confused. Julian hugged him tightly as if trying to shield him from something that, though invisible, had already invaded their lives. An hour later he saddled the mule and hid the backpack inside a sack of corn. He explained nothing to anyone. It was he who went down to the village, who silently left the package, and who received the envelope of money along with another note. Trust is also put to the test. When he returned, he found Rosa with a hardened expression, the look of someone who no longer argued, only endured. What did you tell them? That the boy wouldn't go and that if they needed anything they should come to me. And now we wait. That night, Julian buried the phone at the foot of the oldest coffee tree. He didn't destroy it, only hid it. He knew that if it rang again, there would be no time left to make a choice. Deep down he sensed that the worst had not yet come. 3 days passed since he refused to involve Camillo. Silence returned, dense and almost unbearable. No truck appeared, no calls came, but something had changed. One morning, upon reaching the shed where they stored the fertilizers, Julian found the door ajar. The sacks were ripped, the tools scattered, and a strange smell lingered in the air. On closer inspection, he discovered someone had contaminated the irrigation tanks with chemicals. They're sending us a message, said Rosa, seeing the damage. This isn't a warning, he replied. It's a threat. That very afternoon, an agricultural inspector from the cooperative arrived at the farm. Someone had tipped him off about irregular practices. He found suspicious residues in the barrels and issued a formal warning. This could result in a serious sanction, the inspector explained. They could even temporarily suspend your license to sell coffee. Julian immediately understood this was no coincidence. That night, as he gazed at the fields from the porch under the dim light, he found another note pinned to the window screen with a clip. Refusal doesn't come without consequences. Next time it won't be your land. The following days passed in silence. The farm still stood, but it was no longer the same. Neither was he. He walked cautiously, weighed his words, analyzed every move. The threat had not repeated itself, but it lingered, constant as a shadow. One early morning, while checking the borders of the property, he discovered fresh footprints near the well. Nothing had been stolen, nothing broken, only a clear message left behind. We're still here. That night, he sat alone in the kitchen and wrote a letter. It wasn't for Rosa or for Camillo, but for himself. In it, he confessed what he didn't dare say out loud. Don't look for this, I only helped a wounded man. But helping without asking was also a decision. He hid the letter beneath a loose floorboard where no one could ever find it. Weeks went by and no one knocked on the door again. The phone buried beside the coffee grove was forgotten. Julian didn't want to dig it up. He felt that as long as it didn't ring, he still had room to breathe. He went back to working calmly, turning the soil with his own hands. Rosa began to speak more. Camillo, though he never said a word, seemed to understand what his father had done for him. No one knew why they had been left in peace. Perhaps they no longer served any purpose. Perhaps they knew he would never forget the name he heard that day, Simón Bolívar. And so, what remained was a man marked by a decision, a farmer who only wanted to do what was right, and who ended up paying the price of silence.